The ship shuddered beneath Corporal Daravos's boots as the docking clamps locked her in place. Outside the reinforced viewport, the Velcarith flagship stretched across the stars like a living cathedral, obsidian spires and bioluminescent veins pulsing with cold light. She had 40 seconds before the airlock cycled. 40 seconds before she stood before the sovereign queen of the Velcarith Empire, a species that had glassed 3 colony worlds for what they called dishonesty in treaty. She wasn't a diplomat. She wasn't even supposed to be here. 12 hours ago, she had been guarding a supply depot on Kepler Station when the quantum distress beacon activated. The actual negotiation team, Ambassador Harlow, his 3 attachés, and 2 cultural liaisons, were dead. A reactor breach. The Velcarith had given humanity a 6-hour extension and demanded a replacement representative. Earth Command had scrambled for anyone with security clearance who spoke rudimentary Velcarith. Dara had scored a 42 on her language aptitude test 3 years ago during basic training. She was the only qualifying candidate within range. They had briefed her on the transport. 17 minutes of compressed data fed directly through an earpiece while she changed into a borrowed diplomatic uniform 2 sizes too large. The key rule, repeated 4 times by the frantic liaison coordinator on the other end: do not use sarcasm. Do not use irony. Do not use metaphor unless you define it immediately. The Velcarith linguistic processes are literal. One misread phrase and they will classify the entire conversation as deceptive. The airlock hissed open. The corridor beyond was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. The walls breathed, slow, rhythmic pulses of bioluminescence moving like a heartbeat. 6 Velcarith guards stood in perfect formation, each one 2 meters tall, their carapace armor the color of deep ocean trenches. Their compound eyes did not blink. Their mandibles were sealed flat against their jaw structures, a posture the briefing notes had flagged as formal assessment mode. They were deciding, in the first 3 seconds, whether she was a threat. Dara kept her hands visible, her stride even, her face neutral. She had been trained for high-risk entry scenarios. She had walked into burning buildings and active firefights. But those situations had clear physics. A wall that was on fire stayed on fire. These creatures were calculating her at speed she couldn't measure, in a language she barely understood, for stakes that included 8 billion human lives. The lead guard extended one clawed forearm horizontally across the corridor. The universal stop gesture, at least across 17 known species. She stopped. He spoke in Velcarith, the words clicking and, resonating like stones dropped into deep water. Her earpiece translated with a half-second delay. You are the human representative. Not a question. A classification. Yes, she said, in Velcarith. The word came out rougher than she intended. She didn't have the throat structure for their tonal variations, but it was recognizable. Several of the guards shifted their weight almost imperceptibly. Surprise, the briefing note said, registered in Velcarith through weight distribution changes. The lead guard stared at her for 4 full seconds. Then, he turned and began walking. She followed. The corridor opened into a chamber so vast the far wall was obscured by atmospheric haze. The air carried the faint mineral smell of deep stone, like a cave that had never known wind. In the center of the chamber, elevated on a dais of black crystalline material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, sat the Velcarith sovereign. Queen Velsorin was smaller than Dara had expected. The briefing images had been taken from a distance during the last accord ceremony. Up close, the queen's carapace was threaded with age lines, hairline fractures that had been filled with iridescent resin, a cultural practice indicating lived experience, the notes had said. Not weakness. History made visible. Her eyes were the color of amber lit from within, and they fixed on Dara with an attention that felt physical, like a hand pressing against her chest. The chamber held 37 individuals. Dara counted automatically, the way her training had wired her to assess rooms. 6 guards in formation flanking the dais. 8 courtiers in tiered observation positions. A cluster near the left wall that her briefing identified as the High Translators, beings responsible for verifying the accuracy of all spoken words in treaty proceedings. If the translators flagged deception, proceedings ended immediately. Permanently. No second audience was ever granted. Dara walked to the marked position on the floor, a circle of darker material set into the stone. She stopped. She stood straight. She did not bow. The briefing had been explicit. Bowing indicated subordination in Velcarith custom, which would classify her as a dependent rather than a representative, voiding any agreement she made. The Queen said nothing for a long moment. Then, in flawless English, an act of deliberate precision that made Dara's breath catch, she spoke. The humans sent a soldier. Yes, Dara said. Why not a speaker? Dara kept her voice level. The speakers died. I was available. I am authorized to represent my government in this meeting. The Queen's mandibles shifted. Barely. The high translators near the wall began moving their upper appendages in slow, deliberate patterns, their method of real-time analysis. Dara watched them in her peripheral vision without moving her head. She had been told to watch the translators the way pilots watch instrument panels. They would show her trouble before she felt it. The speakers died, the Queen repeated. Is that a statement of blame toward the Velcarith? Every nerve in Dara's body fired at once. This was the trap. This was exactly the kind of conversational pivot the briefing had warned about, a question that would naturally invite a reassurance, and reassurances in Velcarith linguistic protocol were classified as deflections, which registered as deception. An ironic denial would be worse. Humor was worse still. Any softening of the truth would trigger the translators. She had one option. No, she said. It is a statement of fact. The cause was a reactor failure on our station. Our people died. We came anyway. The Queen was still. The translators stopped moving. For 3 seconds, the chamber held the particular silence of a decision being made. Then, the Queen's eyes shifted, just slightly, toward the lead guard who had walked Dara in. Something passed between them that the briefing had no language for. A recognition. An assessment completed. Continue, the Queen said. The negotiations were supposed to last 3 days. By the end of the first hour, Dara understood they were going to last exactly as long as Queen Velsorin decided they needed to last, and not a second more. The chamber had a rhythm. The Queen would pose a statement. Her courtiers would observe. The high translators would analyze. And Dara would answer, carefully, directly, without ornamentation, and always in the precise number of words the answer required. Not fewer, which the Velcarith interpreted as concealment. Not more, which they read as distraction. She had been in the chamber for 90 minutes when the first genuine crisis hit. The Queen raised the question of the Meridian Exclusion Zone, a stretch of space near the Velcarith border that Earth had quietly been using for debris field navigation. It was technically in disputed territory. The previous ambassador had apparently planned to address it on day 2, buried between 2 more agreeable agenda items. Dara didn't have an agenda. She had 17 minutes of briefing data, a too large uniform, and a translator earpiece that had started crackling slightly in the left channel. The zone designated Meridian, the Queen said. Your vessels have crossed it 43 times in 18 lunar cycles. Explain the purpose. Dara ran through her options in under 2 seconds. She could claim ignorance, inadmissible, classified as deflection. She could minimize the crossings, deceptive. She could contextualize with technical jargon. The translators would flag it as obfuscation. She had one path. Navigation, she said. The debris field on the Kepler side creates safer routing through the zone. Our pilots chose efficiency over protocol. It was a mistake in judgment. Not policy. Not aggression. The Queen was quiet for a long moment. One of the courtiers near the right wall made a small movement, a slight adjustment of posture. Dara's earpiece had no translation for courtier body language, but she had been watching the room long enough to notice that particular courtier had moved 3 times during the session, and each time had preceded a significant shift in the Queen's response. She filed it away and waited. A mistake in judgment, the Queen said, finally. You do not deny it. No. You do not offer explanation as mitigation. Explanation is not mitigation. It is context. The action was still wrong. The translators began moving again, faster this time, their appendages weaving patterns Dara couldn't read. But she could read the courtier. He had gone completely still. That, she was starting to understand, was good. Your predecessor, the Queen said, described the crossings as exploratory surveys that inadvertently intersected the boundary region. Dara kept her face neutral. Exploratory surveys. That was a masterpiece of diplomatic language, technically defensible, thoroughly dishonest, and exactly the kind of phrase that would have been dissected and flagged by every translator in the room. He was wrong to describe them that way, she said. Silence. Then, something happened that was not in the briefing notes. The Queen turned her head, not toward her courtiers, not toward the translators, toward the lead guard who stood at the base of the dais. The same guard who had walked Dara through the corridor. He met the Queen's gaze and held it for 3 seconds, then returned to his forward position. The Queen looked back at Dara. You have been a soldier, she said. It was not a question. Yes. Soldiers learn to speak around difficult truths to protect their unit. Some do, Dara said. I was trained differently. A soldier who lies to command gets people killed. The truth, delivered early, saves time and lives. The Queen's mandibles shifted again, farther this time, in both directions. Dara had no reference for that configuration in her briefing. It wasn't in any of the 17 minutes of data. She watched the courtier. He leaned forward by perhaps 2 centimeters. She held still and let the silence work. The meridian crossings will require a formal acknowledgement in the treaty record, the Queen said. Agreed, Dara said immediately. And a navigational rerouting plan submitted within 60 days. Agreed. These terms are not negotiable. I understand. I agree to them. Another pause. The translators had slowed their movements significantly. The courtier near the wall had relaxed his posture by degrees. The lead guard remained perfect and still, but something in the set of his upper thorax had changed, a minutely different angle than when the session began. The Queen stood. The entire chamber responded, the subtle collective shift of 37 beings adjusting their posture simultaneously. Dara kept her feet planted. We will recess, the Queen said. 3 hours. She descended from the dais. As she passed Dara, she stopped. At this distance, the Queen's amber eyes were extraordinary, not warm, not cold, but deep in the way that ancient things were deep, carrying the weight of every decision made before this one and every one yet to come. She spoke quietly enough that only Dara could hear. In 40 years of treaty proceedings, the Queen said, no human representative has ever admitted fault without being forced. You did so 3 times in 90 minutes. Dara said nothing. There was nothing to say. The Queen studied her for 1 more second. Then, she continued walking, and the chamber exhaled. The recess room was small and functional, a carved alcove off the main corridor where human-compatible atmospheric conditions had been set. Dara sat on a stone bench that had probably been placed there as an afterthought and pressed her hands flat on her knees to stop them from shaking. The lead guard stood at the entrance. He had not spoken since the corridor. Dara drank water from the flask she'd brought, looked at the wall, and ran through the session point by point. She had not made errors she could identify. But she was painfully aware that she was operating on 17 minutes of data, a language aptitude score that would embarrass a first-year student, and instincts trained for entirely different categories of danger. She looked at the guard. Will there be a second session today? He turned his compound eyes toward her. A pause. Then, yes. Is there anything I should know about the afternoon proceedings that differs from the morning format? Another pause. Longer. This was not, she was fairly certain, a standard exchange between a guard and a visiting representative. She kept her expression neutral and waited. The afternoon session, he said, addresses the covenant terms. These are not standard treaty provisions. They are binding oaths in Velcarith law. A representative who affirms them must have full authority to commit their government. If you do not have that authority and you affirm, the agreement becomes void on discovery of the deception. Dara processed this. What happens to the representative when that's discovered? The guard said nothing, which was its own answer. She leaned forward, elbows on knees, and looked at the floor. She had authority to represent Earth Command in this meeting. That had been explicit in her orders. But a binding oath was a different category of commitment than a treaty negotiation. She needed to be certain, and she needed to be certain right now, because the moment she walked back into that chamber and the Queen asked whether she had the authority to commit her government to the covenant terms, she would have exactly 1 chance to answer correctly. She activated her comm. The connection to Earth Command took 40 seconds to secure. The flagship's interference protocols were extraordinary. When the line opened, she spoke for 90 seconds. She gave the facts in order. She asked a single question. The answer came back in under 3 minutes. She closed the comm and sat with it for a moment. Full authority. Confirmed. The emergency provision that had authorized her to represent the government in the first place extended, under its own language, to binding commitment authority in crisis treaty proceedings. The legal team had apparently spent the last 2 hours arguing about it. They had reached the same conclusion. She had the authority. The guard was still watching her. "I have full authority," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, he turned back to face the corridor. The session resumes in 20 minutes. The afternoon session was different in ways that went beyond format. The chamber felt tighter. The courtiers had repositioned, closer to the dais, forming a tighter configuration. The translators occupied a central position rather than the left wall. Their appendages were already moving, slowly, cataloguing the room before anything had been said. The Queen took her position on the dais with the particular stillness of someone who had already decided what outcome she intended and was now measuring whether the circumstances would support it. Dara took her position in the circle on the floor. She noticed that the circle had been cleaned during the recess, the dark material subtly polished. She didn't know what that meant, but she noted it. The first Covenant term took 40 minutes to discuss. It concerned Velcarith access to specific jump corridor data, navigational maps humanity had developed over decades. The previous treaty drafts had offered partial access in exchange for trade concessions. The Queen set those drafts aside with a single gesture. "We do not negotiate for fragments," she said. "Full access, or the corridor maps are not part of this agreement." Dara's briefing had flagged partial access as humanity's position. But her briefing was also 17 minutes old and written by people who were now dead. She looked at the translators. She looked at the courtier who had become her unofficial barometer. He was leaning back very slightly. Anticipation, she had decided, rather than tension. "Full access is possible," she said, "with the condition that the data is used for navigation only, and that any Velcarith vessel operating in human-designated space transmits standard identification protocols." The Queen studied her. "You would not limit the access points." "No. Limiting access would mean we are managing your behavior rather than establishing mutual terms. I'd rather establish the terms clearly and hold to them." The translator's movements accelerated. The courtier sat very still. The lead guard's thorax shifted to that slightly different angle again. "Your predecessor offered 15 access points over 5 years," the Queen said. "That was management, not partnership," Dara said. "I'm not here to manage the Velcarith. I'm here to make an agreement that holds." The second Covenant term was harder. It concerned territorial sovereignty over 2 systems that humanity had surveyed but not settled, and that the Velcarith had ancestral claims to predating human spaceflight by 800 years. It was, in diplomatic language, a legacy dispute. In plain language, it was the hardest kind of argument there was, one where both sides had something real and neither could fully be right. The Queen presented the Velcarith position without preamble. The systems were ancestral ground. Human survey activity represented incursion regardless of settlement status. Dara understood the position completely. She also understood what Earth Command's position was. She had confirmed it on the comm during recess, because she'd suspected this was coming and had asked the second question. "Both claims are legitimate," she said. The room changed. It was almost atmospheric, a subtle shift in how the air felt. "We are not a claim," the Queen said. Her voice had an edge in it for the first time. "We are 800 years of history." "Yes," Dara said. "And we surveyed those systems without knowing that history. Ignorance isn't the same as malice, but it also isn't absolution. Both things are true." The Queen descended one step from the dais. It was a small movement. It was enormous. "What do you propose?" Dara breathed evenly. "Joint designation. The systems recognized under Velcarith ancestral sovereignty. Human scientific access by formal request, with Velcarith approval required. No settlement without consent. No extraction without treaty." The Queen descended the second step. She was now at the base of the dais, standing at a distance that no briefing document would have recommended. "You are giving away territory your government intends to develop," she said. "We don't have the right to develop it without your agreement. That was true before this meeting. I'm just saying it plainly." The translators stopped moving entirely. Every appendage still. The courtier stood up. The lead guard turned, not toward the Queen, not toward the translators, but toward Dara, and held that position for 3 seconds in a gesture her briefing had no language for and her instincts told her was significant beyond any data she had. The Queen was quiet for a very long time. When she spoke, it was not to the chamber. It was to Dara, quietly, in the same register she had used in the corridor when she'd spoken of 40 years of treaty proceedings. I have conducted 9 major treaties, the Queen said. I have watched representatives claim generosity while protecting every meaningful resource. I have watched apologies constructed to avoid admission. I have watched honest words used as currency to purchase trust that was then spent on deception. She paused. You have said things in this chamber today that your government may repudiate when they read the record. They might, Dara said. I'll deal with that when I get home. You are not afraid of that outcome. It wasn't a question, but she answered it. I'm a soldier. I make the best decision I can with the information I have, in the time I have. If it's wrong, I answer for it. That's the job. The Queen looked at her for a very long time. Then, she climbed back to the dais, turned, and, Saturday. The covenant terms will be drafted as you have proposed them, she said. The treaty record will reflect the morning session's admissions and the afternoon terms. Signing will occur at the next full cycle. Dara kept her feet planted and her face neutral and her hands completely still, and she breathed. The translators resumed their movements, different now, longer, slower patterns that the briefing had described, in a single footnote, as the formal recording configuration. The configuration that meant what had been said was being encoded into permanent Velkareth record. The lead guard moved from his position for the first time all day. He crossed to stand 2 meters to the Queen's left, not the traditional guard position, which was the right. Dara had no language for it. But, when she glanced at the courtier, the one she had been reading all day like an instrument panel, he was looking at the guard with an expression she had no Velkareth framework for and needed none. It was the way someone looked when something rare had happened. The Queen raised one hand, a single, deliberate gesture, and the chamber began its formal recess protocol, the 37 individuals redistributing with the quiet efficiency of a machine that had run this sequence many times. Only the Queen remained still. And then, just before the chamber's hum of movement fully overtook the silence, Dara saw it. The smallest possible shift of the Queen's mandibles. Symmetrical. Both sides. A configuration that appeared in exactly 0 pages of her 17-minute briefing. She would find out later, on the transport home with shaking hands and a lukewarm ration pack, when she finally had access to a full Velkareth cultural database, that the gesture had a name. That it was recorded in formal proceedings perhaps twice in a generation. That it was not a diplomatic expression, not a courtly formality, not a negotiating tool. That it was simply, in the oldest register of Velkareth language, the word for, I believe you point to a 2.